Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here with our friend Mike DeCourcy, who graced us with a second coming here onto the Final Fours on the schedule. Mike DeCourcy is a writer for the Sporting News. In addition to finding his writings there, you can find him all over TV, especially in the Big Ten, Big 18 network as an analyst. Mike, thanks so much for coming back on this show.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. It's nice to see you.
I think I can speak safely for Rod, saying that you're one of our favorite sports columnists to have on, since you're not super hyperbolic, and I think you tend to really think through the issues, and so we appreciate your insights and things, and especially appreciate the fact that your stuff's not behind a paywall, so it's easy to get a hold of your stuff. I know you guys have made a point of that at the Sport News to make sure that that's very accessible to fans, and also the fact that you are also a fan, unapologetic for Pittsburgh sports, and so it's kind of nice seeing somebody who's not afraid of being called a homer, things like that, and still be
Well,
able to be
I
objective.
don't like to be called a homer. I'm objective. I
Yeah,
mean, obviously, I want the Steelers and Penguins to win, but when I write about them, and more so the Steelers and the Penguins, I haven't written about the Penguins since they were in the Stanley Cup Finals 7 years ago now.
uh-huh.
But I take a I'm a fair and reasonable writer when it comes to what they do. I don't say bad stuff about the Bengals or bad stuff about the Ravens just because they're the Steelers rivals. I mean, I'm
Right.
going to give them a fair shot.
Yeah. I just, it's fun having people who have a rooting interest and they're also fans in the sport and they can still talk about it, as you said, without being, over the top one way or the other. So it's nice as a sports fan to appreciate that. So anyway, we're going to talk about your recent column on NIL and college sports. But before we do, there have been some other things going on in Big Ten. Namely, the Big Ten will go from 14 to 18 teams by adding schools from traditional Big Ten country, Southern California and Puget Sound. So our focus is not on football of the show, obviously, but clearly football is driving these decisions. But questions kind of start with, what do you think about the West Coast schools entry joining the Big Ten? I mean, do you think they'll be operating from a basketball perspective at a significant disadvantage due to the travel?
Well, not necessarily. I think we've seen the schedules, and I think they're very reasonable in the way they've constructed the schedule. They've assured uh, at least for the first year, and I think it should be enduring that the West Coast schools will play home and home against one another. It doesn't make sense to avoid that or erase that. And I think you can do the same thing on the opposite side so that it becomes reasonable for Penn State and Rutgers and Maryland as well, so that they are not burdened by having to fly to Seattle and Oregon and LA every other week or whatever. So I think that they've done that. I think they've constructed the schedules very well. I think it's important to note that travel today isn't for these teams is not what it was when I first broke into the business 35 years ago. It's not. I mean, I used to see teams in the airport all the time, and the teams I see now are Division III,
Yeah.
NAIA teams. I don't see D1 teams and coaches in the airport any longer, because they're not there. They are flying almost exclusively. They're private, especially at this level, in the Big Ten level. And so it's not the same experience as a result. It's much more comfortable. It's much more direct. You don't have to go through connections and all of that. And I think as a result, it won't have I don't believe, a huge impact on the season. I think what will have a huge impact on the season, do you have enough good players? If you're UCLA and you have enough good players, you're going to find a way to win enough games.
What is your feeling in just the Big Ten, the expansion to 18 teams? I mean, outside of the global understanding that that sort of the alignments have to, this is sort of like almost inevitable with the realignments. What do you think it does for the brand of the Big Ten or to the college fan experience within a conference?
Well, obviously it's changed. There's no doubt about that. But I look at what we've seen in the basically the decade since since this began toward where we have been for the last several years, which is 14 teams. And there was a lot of consternation about the arrival of Nebraska, Maryland, Rutgers, et cetera, how it would diminish. And look what's happened. Rutgers, the rack, and since we're talking on a basketball centric
Yeah.
podcast. The RAC has become one of the great venues in college basketball. They were an absolute disaster for much of the time in the prior years, prior to joining the league, with what happened with Mike Rice, and then the Jordan years. They were a disaster. And now they hired a terrific coach in Steve Peichel, and they have built their arena, not figuratively, but literally, into a fortress. Figuratively, I mean, literally, excuse me, not literally, but figuratively. Literally, it was built a long time ago because I covered a game there when I was covering Duquesne in the late 80s. So it's been literally built for a long time. But figuratively, it's become a fortress for the Scarlet Knights, a great place for them to play. And the arrival of the two great freshman recruits could accelerate that and toward toward real excellence. Maryland has won the conference championship. They've been relevant. They've made NCAA tournaments. Nebraska, obviously a basketball program that has not been elite for really any of its history, but has had one of the best home court environments in any college arena. Pinnacle Bank
Yeah.
Arena, even when they haven't been good, has been excellent. And when they have been good, such as this past season and probably next season, it's been phenomenal. So I think that you look at that and then you add in UCLA and USC, two buildings that I've visited often. Poly Pavilion, one of the grand old buildings. I've told people, I was having a conversation with UCLA's athletic director at a conference that I attended last Friday. And I told him that like, to me, heaven is a January day outside Poly Pavilion waiting to go in and watch a big college basketball game. I mean, that spot, though, that 40 minutes of anticipation with everybody getting excited, and the weather's incredible, and the scenery is beautiful and all of that. It's phenomenal. The Galen Center, one of the really cool buildings in college basketball, just the right size for the Trojans, or at least for the Trojans as they were in the Pac-12. Maybe not big enough for what it'll draw now that they're in the Big Ten. We'll see, but a great basketball building. Heck Ed, I think it's called Alaska Airlines Arena now. It's at the University of Washington. I've covered many games there. One of the best old buildings, kind of like Williams Arena, the barn, that has all that flavor and character. I love going there. I have not been to Oregon's new building. I was at the former building before they renovated and built the Matthew Knight Arena. But we've seen what great crowds they've had there. So it's hard for me to see it as a negative in that sense. Since we're talking basketball first, it's hard for me to see it as a negative to bring them in. I know there are costs, so to speak, and I'm not talking about dollars and cents. I'm talking about lessening of rivalries that have been long established. But I think those forces were inevitable. I think that the ability to package, let's say Washington versus Oregon as a Big Ten game, and put that into a television package. Those first of all, that you have to warrant the Big Ten name, and those two programs certainly do. And then you have to warrant the Big Ten name in terms of what you can bring in terms of markets and followings, and those teams have them. So I think that as a result, you get a boost for the conference, for everybody in the conference. And all you have to do is look at what's being done within the ACC and how desperate Florida State and Clemson have been to try to find a way to get to the kind of money that Big Ten members have already been assured for basically the next decade, to understand what the value can be.
I'll only show my age in that I loathe the Oregon basketball court with all those trees on it. It's very distracting. My son loves it. So there you go. There you go.
So I'd like to take the discussion a little broader for the next couple of questions. We've been hearing particularly the guy who has kind of become the face of this argument, I think, is the commissioner of the SEC, Greg Sankey. And he did it again, I believe, within the last week or so, talking about the expansion of the NCAA tournament. So let's start with this. I've got a multi-parter here. First of all, what do you think the odds are of that happening anytime in the near term, like within the next 5 years?
How expanded are we talking? 72?
Well, that's gonna be my next question, is
Yeah.
if it does expand, how big does it go in
I'd
your
say
view?
the odds of it being at least 72 teams are about 99.99%.
Okay.
That it's going to happen, at least 72.
And you see that happening very quickly.
Yeah, fairly soon. Obviously, if it was going to happen for 25, we'd have it by now.
Right.
But I think it'll be very soon. What I tried to explain in the column that I wrote, that I hoped Sankey would have the business sense to understand. I have not. I know he doesn't have basketball sense. I know he doesn't get the game at all. I've long
Yeah.
since. You know, when his explanation, his first explanation about why we need to expand the NCAA tournament, compared it to Ole Miss winning in baseball, like I knew right away he didn't understand basketball at all. But
Right.
the business sense that I would have expected him to have is, how do you not understand the principle of scarcity?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, I understood that, and I've never sold anything. I mean, I sold magazines that might want in a summer job back when I was in college. But I mean, I don't. My job is not to sell, but I have common sense, and I read and I understand the principle of scarcity. Look, here's the basic. For those who don't or haven't heard of it, I'm sure they understand it, but maybe they haven't heard that term. This is what it comes down to: is if everybody has a Fendi bag or a Louis Vuitton bag, it becomes less desirable to a significant segment of the public. The idea of a Louis Vuitton bag is it's hard to obtain. It's hard, you have to really pay for it. And you know, you can feel badly about that or whatever. You can think that's a bad thing if you're not a capitalist or whatever, but that's business. A Louis Vuitton bag costs what it costs because they want it to be exclusive. And so that's where the value is. In the NCAA tournament, there are 67 games. And in the men's tournament, 67 games. And in this past year, those 67 games averaged 10 million viewers. Slightly lower, but certainly I'm afforded the ability to round up here. 10 million viewers. Those are astonishing numbers. In television, in televised basketball, those are astonishing numbers. In televised college basketball, it's absurd, those numbers, because if you take the top teams in college basketball, they're not regularly drawing 1 million viewers. There's a lot of people watching college basketball because there's so much of it to watch. But any specific game outside of March and outside of maybe Duke Carolina when they're good and a few other assorted games, they're not drawing huge numbers. But you put the NCAA tournament and you put that bracket on a refrigerator, and all of a sudden people are watching by the tens of millions. Okay, so let's get bigger. All right, now the bracket doesn't go on the fridge on one page. Now you need 2 pages. People are going to lose interest. And now you put it on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Instead of starting it on Thursday at noon, it's going to be on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We're going to have games going from 9 a.m. to 12 midnight or whatever, so that we can have 96 or however many games Greg Sankey thinks is sufficient. That's going to ruin the product. More games does not mean more money. That's the key. Look, if you can find some way to get a can opener and open the contract that they have right now, that was foolishly extended by Mark Emmert through 2020 to 2032, that was a bad business move. If you could somehow get a can opener and open that up again, yeah, it'd be worth more money as it is now. It's worth more than $1.1 billion a year, but you signed the contract. So
Right.
if you think by ruining the NCAA tournament, you're going to open it to more to more money, I think that's a mistake, because in the end, you will not.
Yeah, well, you're preaching to the converted with that one. I guess when you say you think it's an inevitability, so by going to, what did you say? You felt 72 was
Yes.
inevitable?
Was
Yes.
Okay.
that 4 more
So
teams?
so we're
Yeah.
really right. So we're really talking about an expansion, a slight expansion of what we've currently had going on Tuesday and Wednesday, right?
If that's the number. When I said
Yeah.
was 99.99% of at least 72 teams.
Okay.
So I know we're going there. The forces for good, let's call it, the smart people in basketball and the smart people in college athletics are trying to keep that, like in, if you ever watched Game of Thrones,
Yeah.
Hodor,
Yeah.
The wall.
they're trying to hold the door
All
at
right.
72.
Yeah.
But on the other side of that wall is Greg Sankey and some other
Mm.
people who think that more games, more money. Obviously,
Right.
it's not that simple, and it's not smart. And here's what they all miss is that if anybody that can bounce a ball 3 times without knocking it off their shoe gets in the tournament, you know what happens? March becomes less relevant, and so does November, December, January,
Yeah.
February.
100%. Yeah,
Yep.
because you're not, those games have less and less meaning. When you're not worried about actually having to earn a bid, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Is there anybody within college? You mentioned the forces of good trying to hold the wall. Is there anybody in particular you're thinking of who within the power structure right now who you think may be able to stem that tide, has an interest in doing so?
I think CBS and Turner have an interest in doing that.
Well,
Uh,
that would be pretty significant.
well, I know they don't want to reopen the contract because they know they're getting a bargain. They have a great product. They're paying under market value for it now until 2032. So they certainly don't want to reopen the contract. I look, that deal is not public knowledge. We know what the terms are in terms of length and payout, but we don't know what the fine print is. If you expand it to more teams, um, does does the NCAA have the right to reopen the negotiation? I don't know
Right.
the answer to that. I think there's a suspicion based on the zeal to try to expand the tournament that it might allow for that. But that's the only way it makes any business sense. And again, I think that that's very short-sighted. It's like
Yeah.
it's like ruining your product so that you can get it sold quickly and out the door. And then when you try to go back in the market now, which would be the case later on, then there's no value in it. And maybe they don't care that there's no value in it because down the road they might see themselves outside the NCAA structure, et cetera. But that March money is quite
It's a
clearly a
lot.
valuable
Yeah.
resource, because if it weren't, then they wouldn't have looped it into this settlement of the NCAA versus House, or House versus NCAA case. They wouldn't have looped it into that. That
Right.
money became extraordinarily valuable. So obviously it has a financial reward. And of course, I don't need to tell anybody about the entertainment value of the NCAA men's basketball tournament.
Yeah, and I think to me that's the biggest element that gets lost in this expansion talk is we all know it's inevitable. If that happens, it's not going to mean we're adding a couple more teams from the West Coast Conference. It's going to likely mean that we're going to see the power conferences basically getting everybody in, which I think in the long run probably has to take away some of the Cinderella element that makes the event what it is in the first place.
And
So,
72 won't change that. 72
right,
will only diminish
Yeah.
it will diminish the value of getting in by some portion, because look, I for since 2020, 2019-20, I've done the brackets for Fox Sports. And so I know what what I have to leave out when I do the brackets each week or when I do the final bracket. I know what's on the other side of that line. It is not pretty. It is
Right.
not like we're leaving out every year terrific basketball teams. That's not the case.
Yeah.
There are in those years we usually get to about 60 and obviously with the automatic qualifiers we usually get to about 65, maybe 66 that look really a lot like tournament teams, but 67 and 68 are not that much different than 68 and 69 and 70. My point being that those teams really belong more out than they belong in.
Yeah.
So
Right.
to say that, well, because this team that is number 68 got in, that clearly 69 and 70 belong. No, 68 doesn't belong in either,
Right.
but they have to get in because that's where the bracket stops.
Right. Right. Um, so when we talk about the last really 3 years or so in particular, it seems to us, and we end up talking about this a lot on this podcast, the impact of the portal and NIL, both, and sometimes in conjunction with each other, on the product, on the actual game of college basketball. Now that we've had it in place for a few years, what do you think the impact has been on the quality and competitiveness of the game? Do you think it's been an overall good, a mix of good and bad? How do you see it now that we've had some experience with it?
I don't think it's made a difference in the quality of play. I think that, well, I shouldn't say that. The transfer portal has not made a difference. People say that, that these teams are all new. My position on this, based on 35 years plus of covering college basketball, is that every team is new every year, even if they return all 5 starters. It's always at least a little bit new because players change, how their competence changes. Sometimes it changes for the better. Most times it changes for the better. Sometimes maybe it changes for the worse because they decided that they were good enough and they were going to spend the summer eating McDonald's and going to the beach. They decided they weren't going to work at it 24 hours a day or whatever. That happens. Sometimes this player made all the sacrifices the year before for whatever success the team achieved, and now he wants his day in the sun. He wants more shots. He wants more opportunities to shine because he probably thinks he needs that in order to get noticed by the NBA. Those things have happened forever, and so teams have always been different. So when you have different personnel, maybe they feel more different. But in reality, every coach starts more or less over after the final game of the prior season and has to reassess and reassert and reassemble and then begin the business of trying to win games in the subsequent year. So I don't think the transfer portal has had the negative impact that people have suggested. And I can show you turnover stats from last year that were down, shooting percentage that was up, scoring was up. So the basketball has not been negatively affected by that. Now, name, image, and likeness has had a significant upward trajectory for the quality of play because name, image, and likeness has allowed players who had gotten through 2 to 3 years of college basketball have made no more than cost of attendance money in say 2018, and now are thinking, man, I don't think I'm going to be a first round pick. Even if I stay here, I'm not going to get any taller. I'm not going to get that much faster. So I got to make some money at this game, even if it's not in the NBA. I know my career is limited. If I'm ever going to get there, probably I got to play. I got to play well in some professional leagues. So let's go to Italy or whatever and get it going. Maybe I'll go to some tryout camps and Portsmouth or a workout or whatever, and an NBA team will like what I do, and I'll fit exactly what they need, and I'll make a team and I'll make some money. And now, instead of doing all that, where they basically are burning their career and hoping that it works out, they say, wait, you're going to pay me how much to stay in college? And then they stay in college. So a guy like Zach Edey is back to become the first back-to-back player of the year since Ralph Sampson for the Naismith people. And a guy like Dalton Connect can find a showcase home like he did at Tennessee. And a guy like Mark Sears can play for Alabama into the Final Four and say, you know what, I'm going to come back in 2020, 24, 25 and try to do that again and maybe win it this time. And all of that is made possible by name, image, and likeness. I can say without much reservation that those guys would not have been in college basketball this year without name, image, and likeness. And I certainly don't think Mark Sears would be back with the Tide next year if he weren't able to be compensated at the level that a high major All-American player is being compensated now.
Isn't it remarkable? At least it seems this way to me, this year especially. It used to be that April and May, the big focus was on, well, who's going to stay in the draft? That is almost, with very, very few exceptions, that is not a point of discussion anymore. Not in the way it was even 5 years ago. It's changed radically for exactly the reasons you just suggested.
Yeah, very few players now that you worry about staying in the draft. For the most part, we know. That doesn't mean players still don't make some mistakes or take some risks. I'm hopeful, for instance, with Bob Carrington at Pitt. I'm hopeful he becomes a first-round pick because I know he's a first-round talent. I think he's rushing it a little bit. Maybe there's somebody telling him and he's a guaranteed first-round pick, and I hope that's true. I remember with Jordan Poole. I thought that he was a first-round talent, and when he left after his junior year, I believe it was, maybe sophomore year, I'm struggling to remember which year it was now. Whichever year it was he left after, I wrote that I thought he was making a huge mistake, and he ended up being next to the last pick or last pick in the first round, and that made all the difference for him, and he's made a lot of money as a result. Good for him.
Right.
I'm happy that worked out for him. But I do think that there are a few risk takers still out there, but most of those players that are pretty clearly second round picks or need to do real work, as in the case of Zach Edey, a year ago, nobody thought he was ever going to be a first round pick. And now with the 2 weeks and change before the draft, most people who are in that universe are convinced he will be at some level.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, certainly if you have extreme talent at basketball, you can take a risk, but for us average folks, don't take a risk with your car. Make sure you head on over to Christian Brothers Automotive in Grand Rapids. They can take care of your car. They're honest technicians. And also you get an oil change now, $40 off if you mention Hoops. If you're a follower of the show, those are the 4 locations in Grand Rapids, from $99.99 down to $59.99. And that will also include a tire rotation and also a courtesy inspection. And also check out the Brothers Who Just Do Gutters. If you need to work with your gutters, make sure you keep that water away from your house and foundation because it can cause all kinds of problems. Don't have a tree growing in your gutter like I did. Make sure you keep those things cleared out. You can also get leaf guards. So now I'm not getting on the ladder anymore. It's great. I really appreciate it. I love it. So if you need it repaired, replaced, or cleaned out, any job, big or small, the Brothers Who Just Do Gutters can take care of it. You can find all that on our support page at the Final Four on the schedule.com/support. Okay. So talking a little bit about the transfer portal, Tom Izzo has definitely been very opinionated about the portal. And I guess we're going to keep this a nuanced discussion. We're not going to talk about whether we think the portal is right from a legal aspect or from moral aspect or whatever. But, his contention is that it's causes some problems with the fact that some players, they enter the portal, they then lose their spot and they never find a home. Cause I think they're like 1,600 or 2,000 players who enter the portal through all of Division I, and some percentage of them never find a new home. And so I imagine their education probably ends. So What do you think about that aspect of the portal as far as it goes? And, and then of course, as a corollary, the other thing that Izzo talks about is certainly the fact that players, if it's tough, you just kind of go somewhere else. And from a character standpoint, it might be a problem.
Well, I think that I have a hard time having sympathy for someone who doesn't find a new home, because how could you be foolish enough to make that move without knowing that there's a home for you? It's like in the working world, you quit a
Yeah.
job without knowing that you have a new job. I mean, it makes no sense. If you have a new job lined up, you go in and tell your bosses, okay, here's my 2 weeks notice, and then you go, I don't know, across town and start working at the other office building. If you don't have that, and you just say, let's go see what's out there. I mean, I have a hard time with sympathizing with that person. And I understand that in some cases they're talked into it by agents,
Yeah.
marketing agents, whatever you want to call it. But again, you have to have some common sense about what your career path is. If you can't figure that out for yourself, then I understand they're young people, but I think you have to do things that make sense in your life. It's just, I know that it's not an easy path for everybody to do what's right and what's smart, and instead of what's convenient. But if you do what's not right and what's not smart, and do only what's convenient, and then it turns out to be inconvenient, again, that is your issue. It's not the system's issue. I'm not endorsing transferring multiple times. What I am endorsing is more colleges being more proactive about retaining their players. I
Yeah.
don't think they're very good at it. And I
Clearly.
don't think it's always because um, that it's easier to move. I think sometimes it's because colleges are offended that they need to pay more. We paid you X number of dollars last year. Well, okay, but I averaged 15 points a game, and that place over there is going to give me 2X. So you should give me 2X. And then the program that player is in now gets angry and says, the heck with you. I know that happens. And I
Yeah.
think it happens too often. I think in too many cases, players could be retained and instead hurt feelings rule over everything. And so then that player ends up leaving as a result. I think that is part of the reason we have more players transfer than maybe is necessary, and certainly is good for the athlete. Remember, it's always better for the athlete academically to stay where they are.
Oh,
Now
for
that
sure. Yeah.
the year in residence is no longer a thing. Before, it could be better for you to transfer because you got a full year of athletic grant and aid where you didn't have to, where you weren't allowed to play. And so therefore, in order to achieve your remaining years of eligibility, you had, let's say if you transferred after your sophomore year, you spent one full year. Now you're basically, you finished your junior year. And then you have seen junior year athletically and senior year athletically. So now you've been there 5 years. And plus you've been there in summers because coaches want you on campus. So you've had the chance to take summer school. In that environment, you had to actively try not to graduate. In this
Right. Yeah.
environment, it's easy not to graduate because you've been at 2 to 3 schools. You've lost credits each time you transferred. You only stay 4 years. It's very possible not to graduate. So academically, this environment is not ideal. And so I'm not endorsing that sense, but I am saying this is the reality that colleges are in. So try to get better at it. I don't see that happening very many places. I will say it's remarkable after the amount of playing time that Cone Carr got and Xavier Booker, that they are on schedule to return as Michigan State sophomores. That is remarkable. So Tom Izzo is doing a good job of retaining his players. Matt Painter is doing a phenomenal job of retaining his players. Very few players have transferred out of Purdue since the a portal became a thing. And I, even the one-time transfer exception. Now we have the multi-time, but even the one-time transfer exception, Purdue lost very few players, and now that it's multi-time, it's still not happening. So there are places where it's being done very effectively, and I endorse that wholeheartly. I'm not saying that I think it's great to transfer 3 times. I don't believe that it is, but it's the reality that we've seen develop through court cases, and it's not going back. At
Yeah,
least
no,
not
there's no
until
question
we
about
get,
that.
yeah, it's not going back until we get, if we get employer-employee status.
Right.
Yep.
So
100%.
along those lines, as you mentioned, Izzo, good retention with players that there was certainly fans are worried about Booker leaving and Carr leaving. And then not surprisingly, fans want other players to leave and to be replaced by other players in the transfer. When it comes to, it seems like obviously you have a new coach, you have to rebuild your whole roster, people leave, and that's just sort of the nature of things right now. So that's sort of that's just goes with the business sort of, I think. But there's certainly programs that seem to have a lot of transfers every year. It's sort of like the MO in some respects, and it seems kind of random as far as how well those pieces fit together any one year. I think Kansas State's a good example. Like they were, Elite Eight, and this last year they didn't make the tournament, and essentially the same sort of plan, we'll call it, or whether it's intentional or not, I guess. Do you think? But is a plan like Izzo's where you retain players? Is that more of a? Do you think that puts them at a competitive disadvantage? That you may have more of a consistent program, but you're not going to be able to cycle up and be successful, or do you think his plan is probably a better plan than one where you're just rebuilding all the time?
Well, I will say that if you look at it, this last year's national championship game was played between one team that had 1 transfer in its primary rotation and another team that had 2 transfers in its primary rotation. So what does that tell you? I think the answer to that is that you're not at a competitive disadvantage if the players you're beginning with are capable players. If you're starting with Zach Edey and Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer and all these capable players, and then you add to that Lance Jones, or you're starting with players like you've got the terrific core that Connecticut had, and then you add in one from East Carolina, and then the following year from Rutgers, and you complement the core that you recruited out of high school. I deal a lot with the Big East for a program that I contribute to called Inside the Big East on FS1, and I've spoken to Danny Hurley about how important it is to him to develop players like Alex Caravan, who is coming back for next season and it is ticketed to be the star of the UConn Huskies next year. It's important to them to do that. Stephon Castle, who they recruited out of high school and was a smash as a freshman. Donovan Clingan, who they recruited out of a Connecticut high school, right up the road from Storrs. Donovan Clingan was a recruit who they only had 2 years, but he was a contributor to 2 championship teams, a significant contributor one year and a dominant contributor the next year. So those guys all were built with internal players, and then they brought in 2 transfers, one primary rotation player, a starting player, I should say, in 2023, as well as a couple of reserve players. And then this year, they brought in Cam Spencer to join the rotation as well, and take a very wide open spot in their roster. They really didn't have anybody to fill that spot. They bring a player like Cam out of the transfer portal. He excels, and they win another championship. At the same time, Alabama, I remember looking at, they had a couple of high school guys and mostly transfers, some of them long-term, like Mark Sears, who will play his 3rd year this year, and some who had just arrived. And NC State was certainly a very transfer-dominant team. So of the Final Four, half transfer-based, half high school core-based. But I will say that you mentioned one example of a team that was very transfer oriented, failed. I think there's no better example of that this year than Arkansas.
Yeah.
Arkansas, which played in two of the previous three Elite Eights, and then came back with another group that was fairly new and completely imploded. Chased their coach all the way to California, so to speak. I mean, it didn't work at all. And there's one thing I tell people now is to expect things like that to happen. You're going to have years where you go out if you're basing your team on imports, you're going to have years where they aren't good enough, they don't fit together, they don't like each other, whatever it might be, and you can't get it you can't get it turned. Even if you're a terrific coach like Eric Musselman, you can't get that turned. There are going to be years like that for even major programs like Arkansas. That's going to happen in various places. It's going to happen. It happened at Carolina in 2023. It happened to them, even though they were basically the same team. That's why I tell you before
Yeah.
that teams change, even if the players stay the same. That team stayed the same, but they didn't stay the same. They didn't like playing with each other anymore. They wanted to be apart. A couple of personnel changes, and all of a sudden they're good again. So it's really hard to predict from year to year who's going to get it right now. I think that's something that fans are going to have to tolerate. That if you've got a great coach and his mix goes wrong, you can't start screaming for a new coach. You just got to say, okay, hey, our all-time great coach or whatever, you got to get it right this time.
All right. So you mentioned a little while ago the House versus NCAA case, and I wanted to turn to that because you've written about it, and I know you have some what I think are interesting thoughts on implications of that case. But I wanted to start with the idea. It seems to me that the issue that certainly coaches, maybe athletic directors, definitely athletic directors, and decent percentages of fan bases have with the current environment is what I would call the lack of stability. Just what we were just talking about is one example of this. You have these massive churning rosters year to year is one example of it. Do you think that the House case, and as I understand it, we've had a settlement accepted by the parties. I don't believe the court has approved it yet. That's where we are at the moment as we record this. But let's assume that it's approved by the court. Do you think that that case, at least for the moment, solves some of these issues? Or are there concerns that perhaps this might actually just set up the next wave of litigation to come on fronts like antitrust and Title IX?
I think especially Title IX, antitrust. I think that one's a hard one to push because they've already lost pretty much all they can in that department. I'm not sure where the next antitrust lawsuit would go, but Title IX could be problematic in that area uh, because the money is coming out of the schools now. That 22 million
Right.
figure. When it was coming from exterior sources, you couldn't tie education to that. And they're trying very hard among NCAA members to avoid the employer-employee relationship, and I understand
Yeah.
why. In part because how do you define that? I still don't know who is an employee and who is not. If you know in that theoretical universe. I mean, for instance, I use this exam as an example in this discussion. Dartmouth was the school, the basketball program that sued or took a case to the NLRB to be declared as employees. That men's basketball at Dartmouth. Now, the Dartmouth men's basketball team home attendance averages fewer than 690 spectators a game. Now, I lived in Indiana for 10 years, and there were probably 200 high schools in Indiana, and that may be an underestimation, that drew more than
Right.
890
Oh,
spectators to
sure.
their games. So then now is everybody there an employee of their high school? I don't know where you draw the line there. I really don't. And it's not like, okay, they don't draw any fans, but all their games are on TV. Really? You know they're not. I've never seen a Dartmouth basketball game on television, and I'm a basketball junkie. So no, I mean, I don't know how you get there, and as a result, if you get there, who is included along the way? So it's a really complicated issue when it comes to that employer-employee, and I understand why they're trying to avoid it. But in this settlement, it does seem like it opens doors more than it closes them. It
Yeah.
does seem like if that 22 million is out there for athletes, how does it go primarily to specific areas, presumably football, perhaps to some to men's basketball? How does it go to those areas and not to other areas? Uh, if they're not employees. So I think it really adds a level of complication for every athletic administrator that goes into that space, into that $22 million space. I think it adds a layer of complication for all of them. And I don't, as I said, I think it opens more doors than it closes.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why they're still begging Congress to try to give them some guidance.
That's when you're in
Well,
trouble. You're asking Congress for solutions.
that's specific to the antitrust issue as I see it. It seems to me this case is intertwined with the notion that they're going to continue specifically. Now, they may ask Congress to do other things too, but specifically that they're looking for an antitrust exemption equivalent to the one baseball has had for a century plus. And I don't know that I believe the odds of that are particularly good, but I guess we'll find out. One more aspect of this that I wanted to ask you about, because it's something in your latest writing, I believe that you touched on that, and I think you might have even gotten into this with us when we had you on last summer. The idea that the NCAA has acted as a liability shield for the individual members, for the schools, is an interesting one. Um, do you think that this particular case and how it was resolved essentially puts to bed, at least for the near term, this idea that we've heard about a lot the last year or two in the media that the power schools, at least for football, may decide to break away from the NCAA and form their own institution?
Well, I remember before Charlie Baker was hired. So I think this would have been 2 years ago. I think it would have been 2 years ago. I talked to I wrote an article about what sort of person the NCAA should hire, and not my opinion, but I got the opinions of a lot of principals in college athletics, Jay Billis, some sitting ADs, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember a lot of feedback in those conversations that the Power Five football separation was imminent.
Right.
How imminent? Next 6 months, next year, whatever. But it was imminent. And then all of a sudden, about 6 months later, within the next 6 months, that started to get shut down. And I believe firmly that the reason that conversation disappeared was this case, House versus NCAA, that they saw that what was coming. And that if they were out there on their own without the NCAA as the shield, and when I say as a shield, I'm talking about their reserves, their bank account that's putting up like 2 million or so, or excuse me, 2 billion of the settlement, as well as future NCAA tournament revenue, which was another shield. And a lot of the other money is coming from that.
Yeah, you'd
So,
mentioned that. Yeah.
yeah. So as a result, that's why that died down then. And now they've seen how much money can come out of them if they go out and make their own deal without resolving all these elements that we talked about, whether it's how you split up the 22 million or whether it's employee or whatever. If you go out on your own and you form under the banner of the college football playoff, well, I don't know specifically how much money that generates annually because college football is not my primary sport. I know and have known the figures on men's basketball tournament since 2008. But now, that money, however much money it is, let's say it is 800 million a year. Maybe that's not the right number, but let's say that's what the number is. Well, that 800 million all of a sudden becomes a fund that other attorneys are going to see as let's go get some of that.
Right.
And so that's why they haven't, and it's why they probably can't. And the fact that the fact that they are now tied into this settlement, which comes from future NCAA tournament revenues for the next 10 years, I don't see them leaving the NCAA for a long period of time as a result.
Yeah, ties all the way back to the potty money they need is access because of the, and that's almost all the revenue is generated from the NCAA tournament basketball, right? So you fiddle with that too much and you wreck that, then you're really in trouble.
Yeah, that's the theory. I mean, remember the 1.6 billion that is coming from NCAA memberships. One of the things that have been bothered by the conversation around this about the supposed burden on the smaller conferences. First of all, part of the reason these rules have stayed in place is that the mid majors, let's say, the low majors, they didn't want the power conferences to have a financial advantage in the recruitment of athletes. If it became that you could pay them or find a way to pay them through NIL or whatever, if it had become that way through NCAA action, then it would have they would have felt like they were at a disadvantage because they didn't have the resources, and so they often used the one school, one vote out of 300 and 350, let's say it was back in the day. Sure. They often use that to keep those rules in place. So they have a significant amount of fault in why this situation is where it is. And so that's A, and B, they all benefited from not having to pay their athletes for a long period of time, at every level. So I don't have the sympathy for them, but it also ignores the fact that no one is taking a pay cut here. Everyone is just getting less of a raise because we were at $770 million for the NCAA tournament for the last period of years. It goes back quite a few years, but for the last period of years, it's been $770 million payment annually from the NCAA, from the television networks to the NCAA, and then the NCAA distributes that money on to the conferences through various formulas. That's the way it's been until now. Now it's going to be $1.1 billion starting this March. That's where the money's going. So that's a huge raise. So everybody's just getting a little bit less of a raise instead, or maybe a lot less of a raise, but less of a raise than they would have otherwise. So it's not like they've been getting all this money for years and now they're going to get less. They're just going to get less than the more they were going to get. And so that narrative, again, has not been totally honest. It's a convenient one. Oh, the poor little guy, but it's not totally accurate.
And I think as you mentioned in your recent article on this, the other element is that, at least for me as a basketball first fan, my big concern with this idea about the power schools choosing to leave the NCAA is, well, what happens to the NCAA tournament when those schools are no longer members of the NCAA? Now, at least, we have a sense that the NCAA tournament itself is not under imminent threat, if you believe that everybody's going to stay within the rubric of the NCAA.
Well, it would now cost a significant amount of money for any for any one group to leave the NCAA. Let's say all the power schools. I think there are roughly 70 of them. If they all got together and said, "The heck with this NCAA," well, right now they're on the hook for about $660 million. So, like, they already have to pay this extra $22 million to their athletes that it doesn't come out of thin air. I mean, they've got to find a way in their budgets. And you know how businesses are, especially when they're nonprofit, in the sense of the college athletics uh, scheme. They are budgeting. Okay, we're going to get X number of more millions of dollars. Okay, here's how we budget that money. It's not like they've been sitting around saying, "Hey, if we get hit, we got 20 extra million dollars that we can deal, with whatever we come up with." No, I mean that money's already been committed in some direction in whatever project or employment uh, group that they have. It's already probably committed, and now they have to figure out a way to find that extra 20 million. And on top of that, you're going to come up with between the 70 of them, $660 million. I don't think they're going to do that because, again, what people forget is there are significant startup costs to form your own organization.
Sure.
You got to find an office. You've got to find a staff. You've got to get it all in place. That costs a lot of money. Right now, you got the NCAA handling all that for you. The College World Series, get on a plane to Omaha. Women's College World Series, you go to Oklahoma. The Final Four is in San Antonio next year, et cetera, et cetera. All of that we know, and there are people at the NCAA who've done these tournaments for years. They know how to do them in their sleep. They're great at it. They don't have to right now. The schools don't have to deal with any of that stuff. They'd have to find a way to do all of it if they were to leave the organization. And so it doesn't make any sense on any level. And I try to tell people that, and I've tried to tell people that for half a decade. And I think maybe now they're starting to see it now that we have the settlement in the House case, but maybe they're not.
Well, quick order of business too. If you need your windows cleaned, head on over to the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. They can take care of things. They take care of my windows. They do fantastic work. 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when getting your estimate and anywhere in the Grand Rapids area. They're so good. They even know the state capital in Lansing. So they have big range and region. So check out the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. They will take good care of you. And also Nudge Printing for all your printing needs for Spartan Apparel or any other school in the state of Michigan and just some random schools around the country like, Indiana and Texas State. So if you need stuff from them, you head on over to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com, 20% off. Again, if you type in Final Four just as one word in checkout. So turning back to the Big Ten, a couple new coaches this year. There's Dusty May at Michigan, Jake Diebler at Ohio State. There's Musselman, who's bringing his shirt and the rest of it and his talents out to USC. And then finally, Sprinkle up to Washington. Of those four coaches, which one do you think is going to be, this is going to be have the best long-term success? And I don't know however you define long-term for coaching. Is that 5 years, 10 years? I don't know.
Yeah, gosh, that's a tough question. Long-term success, especially in the environment we've discussed.
Yeah.
I would say probably that Dusty May is well positioned to do that. Michigan is, a fine university. It's in a good position from the standpoint of facilities. I remember Brian Ellerby back when he was coaching, taking me for a walk through their facilities, and you had to go. At that point, you had to go from the the hallway through the wrestling room to get to what was their video room, something like that. And they've done an amazing job. I've been to their practice facility since. It's terrific. They rebuilt Chrysler. It's great. So they've got everything in place there. They've got a very supportive administration with Ward Manuel. So I think that Dusty May is well positioned to do that. I think Danny Sprinkle is going to do a great job in Washington. Musselman will Yeah, he's just a fantastic coach. He's won everywhere he's been. He will win without a doubt in my mind at Southern Cal. But when I say all of that, somebody's got to lose. I mean, you got 18 teams. Somebody's got to lose. And so that's the question is, who are the losers in this expansion? Because there's you've got 4 new teams. Somebody's going to finish 18th now.
Yep.
That's it's going to this league. I remember in 2020 when there was no tournament because of the pandemic, the Big Ten would have gotten 10 out of 14 teams into the tournament, which would have been a remarkable performance. And 12 of them total were still in the hunt when we got to March 1st. They were still in it, or maybe February 25th was the date, but like really late in the year. Purdue was still in it. Minnesota was still in it, and they just they lost a game or two, went the wrong direction, and wouldn't have made it in the environment that eventually developed. But we're right there. So 12 out of 14 was remarkable. Could I see 14 out of 18 being competitive in a given year? 100%. It's going to be hard, but I could see that because the programs that they brought in, they didn't bring in any bad basketball programs. Those programs have been highly competitive for most of the past decade. I mean, Washington it's been a while since they've been great, but they certainly have the capacity they won the Pac-12, I believe, in 2019, so they did have that year. But since they've been consistently great, probably goes back another 8 or 9 years from there. But SC, UCLA, Oregon, those teams have been in and around the tournament every year. So it's going to make the Big Ten even more competitive than it already was. I'm excited about it. If I were a coach, I'd be a little bit nervous about it. But I think it's going to make for, obviously, for those of us who work at BTN, we're going to have a lot of cool stuff to talk about.
Yeah. Were you a little bit surprised by Ohio State's decision to make Jake Diebler the full-time guy? Obviously, he had a great close to their season. There's no debating that, but that's a program. I think there was a lot of anticipation when they decided to part ways with Chris Holtmann that they were going to be a player for some big names. Dusty May was a guy who was mentioned with that job. Sean Miller, lots of different names. Were you surprised they opted to go that way, or do you think it was they felt like they had no choice?
Being totally honest, I was very surprised because they did have a choice. You don't have to hire the interim guy, and I did not give them. I did write a column at my editor's request, ranking or grading, I should say, the hires that were made at the high major schools, and I didn't give it a great grade, in part because I felt that the one element to me that seemed like a defensible argument for why you would hire him was you had a pretty good young group of players. He connected with them well enough to produce significant results down the stretch, including a win over the eventual national runner-up. And okay, so if he's connected to them, he can get these guys going forward. And I know he's been involved in recruiting them to be here in the first place, so maybe he can do that with the next group. But then a lot of those players, Roddy Gale, for example, started to transfer out, which undermined that argument of it. Now, they have done pretty well subsequently in bringing in replacement for guys like Gale and Key and players like that who left. But it still does raise the question for me, what exactly was the impetus to hire him as opposed to going in the market and finding a up and coming coach who had a win-loss track record. Jake doesn't have that. He did, other than the 9 or 10 games that he coached for the Buckeyes at the end of last year.
Yeah, must have been spending other money. Brian Kelly or Chip Kelly from UCLA, right? Bringing the football program. A couple quick questions. It'd be remiss not to ask you a question. What Michigan State next year lose obviously Tyson Walker, Malik Hall, and Hogard is leaving, we'll say. And he's going to go to Vanderbilt. What do you see for the Spartans? And from all we've seen, at least this point, it looks like Jeremy Fears is going to be pretty much okay from what we've seen as far highlights.
Yeah, I think if Jeremy is healthy and the player that I saw play for the USA, uh, they'll be better at point guard.
Yeah.
I did not admire the year that AJ had last season for the Spartans. Tyson Walker's a significant loss. I mean, he was a bucket getter. Replacing that will not be easy. He was a bucket getter. He was a bucket getter in big games, in big moments. He didn't succeed every time, but he succeeded in a lot of key moments. I thought that losing him is a challenge to replace. And when you look at it, maybe Jace Richardson can be a help in that area. Maybe I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name. Tang.
Kurtang, yeah.
Kurtang, yeah, it's actually
yeah. I mean, maybe he can be a help there, but that wing position is a challenge for the Spartans. But I'm a huge believer in Carr. I thought Booker from the jump last year should have been playing more minutes because I thought the offense flowed more naturally when he was out there. I thought it really stagnated when you couldn't throw the ball inside. And I'm not talking about expect the basket. I'm just expecting it to retain it. That was a huge problem for the Spartans last year. When they threw the ball inside, the odds of retaining it were not what they should have been. I'm not going to make any speculative analytics about what the numbers were. Like, I'm not going to say they lost at half the time or whatever, because they didn't lose at half the time, but they lost it way more often than an ordinary team does. And so what happens when you start seeing those balls get fumbled out of bounds or fumbled in the opponent's hands is you stop doing it. And so you probably lost 50% of your post continuity because you either lost it or you didn't feel comfortable throwing it there in the first place. I thought when Xavier played, that problem diminished, and I thought that they should have tried to use him more as a result. So that if they can find some perimeter offense from someone, then I think they can be very competitive. But that they've got to, and I know Cone will give them some of that, but the current Cone Carr, the one we saw, isn't going to replace what you lose in Tyson Walker. Now, if Cone goes out this summer and gets himself a jump shot, then he's going to be one of the better players in the country. So I can't rule that out. I've seen players improve. But in my mind, the Cone Carr that we know is a guy who's going to excel in transition, going to be hard to play against, going to be difficult to keep out of the lane, is going to play above the rim a lot. But that doesn't resolve the problem of trying to restrict the defense from converging on the lane. Somebody's got to come along and start making jump shots.
Yeah, I think that their expectation or their hope at this point is that Jaden Akins steps forward into some of the role that Tyson Walker occupied last year. And honestly, that's a big part of the reason, as I understand it, why, getting back to what you were talking about earlier, they were able to retain him rather than see Jaden hit the transfer portal, is that they've told him essentially, all right, it's your time to be in that same kind of more ball dominant role that Tyson Walker was in, as opposed to what he's been, which is primarily a spot up shooter.
Yeah, and I think that Jaden, the spot that Jaden was in was a difficult one. It's hard to be that guy who gets only a select number of shots, and in the number of competitive games, the close competitive games the Spartans played, every shot he took was consequential. And when that's the case, that's a hard position to be in, because if you miss, so much changes, and that burden becomes really, really weighty. And so now he'll get more shots, and it won't be so punishing when he misses.
Right.
And he'll be able to be the player he's capable of being, because he's got significant talent.
Oh, for sure.
He can really shoot. He's got a good first step. Now, what he's got to do is, again, because of the position he was in, I think he often felt constrained to playing as a jump shooter. I believe that to become a truly significant Big Ten player, he's got to be a multi-dimensional player. He's got to believe in his ability to put the ball on the floor and either get it all the way to the rim or get it deep and make a play for a teammate, or make a pull up or whatever it might be, or get fouled. Fouled is a big thing. Jaden needs to get fouled. He needs to
Yes, we
learn
agree.
how to get fouled.
Yeah.
He shot very few free throws in the previous 2 years. He's got to, if he doesn't get fouled, Michigan State will struggle. But if he learns how to play to contact and get himself fouled, he can be a real asset.
Yeah, and my final question is: any idea of Big Ten tournament where it's going to be this next year? Is there? I mean, it's like a
Nope.
radio silence. I was hoping that maybe you'd have my family. We always go, and we're trying to figure out where's my son's starting school at Purdue at Indianapolis this fall, so we're hoping it's in Indy. It seems like that'd be a likely option at this late in the year to try and find a venue like Vegas or something like that. What is your feel for where it's going to be?
Yeah, I think it will be West at some point, but I don't think they'll do that so suddenly.
Right.
In the first year of the new members, as well as with so little lead up time. I suspect that this year will wind up in Indy or Chicago, because those two places can snap their fingers and put on a Big Ten tournament and do it
Yeah.
fabulously. So I suspect there'll be one of those two places. Since the most recent one was Chicago, I agree with you that Indy is the most likely scenario for this year. I will be surprised if it doesn't wind up in one of those two spots, but I'll admit to being surprised that it's early June and I still don't know where we're going next March. That's usually that is something that's established well in advance, and for some reason they still have not pinned that down for us. They may have it
Yeah.
pinned down for them, but they have not made it public knowledge for us.
Yeah. I was hoping you had a secret that you could tell us. All right.
Sorry.
Well, Mike DeCourcy from the Sporting News. Thanks so much again for joining the Final Fours on the schedule. Really appreciate your insights. Look forward to watching you on BTN, talking about all 18 teams as you work our way through the season. Thanks so much for coming on.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, guys.
All right. Until next time, the Final Fours on the schedule. Go green.